We're in Luke, as we have been and will be for the rest of the quarter. And I believe actually we're in Luke next quarter, if I remember right. Of course, Luke gives us more detail. It's the longest of the three synoptic gospels. So it's a good book to be in for a while, I believe. Tom ended last week with at chapter 5, verse 26, I believe. Verse 27 through 32, I think we covered 2 or 3 weeks ago when we had the lesson on the calling of the disciples. And these verses cover the calling of Matthew. We'll get back into, say, verse 29 through 32 of that section, which actually deals with the subject of today. And today the subject is the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. We're going to be looking at, last week was one event. We're going to look at 4 others this week. So there's a total of 5 of these events where Jesus and the Pharisees have a conflict. The first was, as I say, last week when Jesus told the paralytic he forgave his sins, and that disturbed the Pharisees. That was the first conflict. The second of the 5 is Jesus still eating with sinners and tax collectors, which we'll get into today. That story starts in Luke chapter 5, verse 29. And this is right after Matthew was called to be a disciple. All 5 of these conflicts are covered in all the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You need to remember as we get into verse 29 that Matthew was called Levi before he became a disciple. So that's what we see in verse 29 is Luke is referring to him as Levi. So let's look at Luke chapter 5, verse 29. Then Levi held a large banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. Notice Luke refers to this group as tax collectors and others. Now, the Pharisees would refer to bad Jews and all Gentiles as sinners. Of course, Luke was a Gentile, and it's believed he didn't appreciate that term, sinners. So notice he called them tax collectors and others. When he quotes the Pharisees, he will use the term sinner, as we see in verse 30. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect, complained to the disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Notice the Pharisees addressed the disciples. Jesus is eating with a large gathering. It's believed most of the gathering are friends of Matthew, who would most likely be tax collectors. The Pharisees are probably outside the dwelling watching. They don't want to go in and eat with these sinners. So they question the disciples why this is going on. Why do they feel free to eat with sinners and tax collectors? But even though they address the disciples, Jesus is the one that responds to their question in these next 2 verses. Verse 31, Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repent." Now, Jesus is not saying that the Pharisees don't need to repent, but a person can't repent if they don't realize they're sinner, right? Now, the religious leaders would refer to tax collectors and bad Jews and Gentiles as sinners. So these people already knew they were sinners. But nobody has told the Pharisees they're sinners. So they're not aware that they need healing. They're not aware they're sick. So Jesus can't come to them and give them spiritual healing because they're not aware they need it. So he's not referring to them as people who are well. He's just saying he has to come to those who know they're sick. Now, most of the conflicts we see between Jesus and these Pharisees deal with the traditions of the Pharisees. These traditions had worked their way into their everyday life and was a part of their worship. But the traditions that these Pharisees were pushing onto society were actually stumbling blocks for the common people. The elders, the scribes, the leaders, the religious leaders over the years had tried to sort out the laws of Moses into something that guides them through everyday life. And over the years, traditions had crept in, and the law additions have been made to the law. And so in this process, they lost the spirit of the law and actually the meaning of the law. So these traditions and rules were now empty and of meaning or compassion. And as a result, Jesus' actions often conflicted with their religious traditions. And that's what we're going to see in these, we got 3 other conflicts to go through. That's what we see in these conflicts. The third conflict deals with fasting. And we're going to see that in verse 33, chapter 5, verse 33. They said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking. We know that Jesus fasted. Remember the 40 days in the desert? And there's other times in the Bible it seems that he was fasting. You remember the time he was with the lady at the well, and the disciples went into town to get something to eat, and they came back and offered him food. And he said, no, I have had food you don't know about. It's believed that he often was fast, but he wouldn't make a point of it, and he wouldn't make a big deal of it. And that's what we see in his teachings. If we look at Matthew 6:16 in the Sermon on the Mount, he teaches about fasting, and I have that here. I'll read that. Matthew 6:16 through 18. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you're fasting. So fasting was not supposed to be something that was on public display. Now, the law of the Old Testament actually prescribed a fast on the Day of Atonement, but all other fasts were supposed to be voluntary. They would be the result of a person in serious prayer or serious deep thought or concerns, the result of some issue they're dealing with. And the Old Testament actually rebuked fasts that were hypocritical. In Isaiah 58, 3-7, it talks about the people fasting, but it was all for show. And the fact that these Pharisees even brought this up shows that they think of fasting as an outward display of one's spirituality, which, as we said, is not what Jesus is teaching about fasting. The point that that John's disciples also fasted, as the Pharisees pointed out. If you look at John's message, it was one about repentance and turning from your sin. That's more in line with a fast. But Jesus' message was more about the kingdom, the new kingdom, his bride. He's establishing his bride on earth. So his teaching was not as much in line with fasting as John the Baptist was. And we see that in verse 34, Jesus answers, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast." So Jesus is teaching that fasting is not something done ritualistically because of a certain day of the week or a certain time of the year, a certain day of the month. It's not something that can be scheduled. It's excuse me. It's done out of a condition of the heart. It's in response to a condition someone would find themselves in. And it's not necessarily for public display. Notice Jesus compared his disciples to guests at a wedding. And a wedding is a joyous occasion, and who would think about fasting at a wedding? Sometimes those wedding feasts would go on for several days, and that would be difficult to fast during a wedding. But it seems like verse 35 would be confusing to these Pharisees and even the disciples. Because if Jesus is the Messiah, as we see he points out later on, then why would he be taken away? Why would the bridegroom be taken from them? Of course, I think he said a lot of things they didn't understand, and they kind of just ignored them. This next group of verses doesn't really deal with a conflict. It's or a confrontation with the Pharisees. It's actually a parable. And now all three Gospels give this parable, but only Luke calls it a parable. And actually, this is the first parable we come to in the Gospel of Luke. So verse 36, he told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. So what he's describing here is you have an old garment and it's something wrong with it, it's tore, it has a hole in it, whatever. You go out and you buy a new garment and you tear a piece off and you patch the old garment. Now you've just ruined the new garment. The patch doesn't match the old garment because of fading and wear. So now you have two garments that are bad. And as he says, no one does that. And of course, he's referring to the old religious system and his new teaching, calling the old garment the old system. He can't bring his new teaching and patch up the old system the Pharisees are familiar with. And he continues this idea with a second illustration in verse 37. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skin, the wine will run out, and the wineskin will be ruined. Now, when wine ferments, it gives off gas, and the container has to expand to adapt to that pressure. My dad raised grapes for a while, and he tried to make wine. And he would put this grape juice in these wine bottles, and then he'd put a balloon over the top, and it would hang there. And he stacked these bottles around. Like I was a kid, it was interesting to watch, but these balloons would perk up and swell during the formation process because the wine is giving off gases, and the container needed to expand to hold the gases. And that's what is happening here. That's what Jesus is talking about. As the wine ferments, the skin needs to be able to stretch and handle that pressure. And the new skins will stretch. They have some elasticity. But once they've done that, and they become old skins, if you put new wine in there, they can't stretch anymore, so they tear. That's what he mentions, that the container gets ruined and the wine spills out, you've lost it all. This was probably common knowledge to these people in that day about how wine works and how to use wineskin. So he's not telling them something they're not familiar with. But of course, again, he's trying to talk about putting his new teaching into their old system. And as we go through this, I think you'll see why that just doesn't work. In verse 38, no, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. By the way, Dad's wine wasn't good. We quit making that. It was better to drink the juice, the grape juice, than it was to drink the wine. But new wine must be put into new wineskins. Now, Jesus has given two illustrations to say that the former ritualistic, ceremonial-ridden system where they practice fasting on certain times, that doesn't fit into Jesus's teachings. And Jesus is presenting what we call the new covenant, or we actually call it the New Testament. It's the birth of his church, his new kingdom is coming about. And it doesn't fit into their old system. Now, these next verses, well, the next verse is only found in Luke. As I mentioned, all three of the synoptic gospels have this story, but only Luke gives us verse 39. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new. Or they say the old wine is better. The old is better. So Jesus admits that they aren't going to want his new teaching. People familiar with the old system, who grew up in the old system, who are familiar with the traditions and the ceremonies and the holidays, they're not really going to be interested in following his new teaching. People are going to say the old is better. And after all, their system is made up of rules, and rules are easier, really. I mean, just tell me what I need to do, when I need to do it, how often to do it. I'll put it into my routine, and I'll do all that and plan on going to heaven. It's a nice, easy system to use. The Muslims have what they call the 5 pillars of Islam, and they're considered mandatory for any of their followers to go to heaven. It's a good set of rules. Some churches tell us we need to worship on Saturday. Some churches tell you you got to have the Lord's Supper every Sunday. But the fact is, we kind of love these rules. We love to know exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Then Jesus comes along and says, love your neighbor, turn the other cheek, make disciples out of me. He actually even says, love your enemy. So we can kind of see why some people might want to stick with the old system. One commentary said that these words that Jesus spoke about wanting the old wine, said they were spoken in a tone of tolerant pity for those prejudiced toward the laws and customs. It's easy to pity, or it's easy to understand why people would want to stick with their old system. A lot of people just don't like change, but in this case, that you had to go from following rules to following your heart, a much different system. Now we move into chapter 6, And chapter 6, verse 1 through 11 is the focal verses today. This is actually the part we're supposed to focus on today. And these last two conflicts of the five that we've been touching on here are covered in these next 11 verses. And they both of these conflicts coming up deal with the Sabbath. The word Sabbath comes from a Hebrew term meaning to cease. Do we know what book where somebody quit working, ceased working? Where do we find that in the Bible? The first. Genesis, yeah. Yeah, God quit his work of creation and rested on the seventh day of the week. Of course, everything first happened in Genesis, didn't it? And it interesting, in Genesis, in those days of creation, it said the evening and the morning were the first day, or the second day, or the third day, whatever. And so the Jews always followed that. The day started in the evening and ended the next evening. And that's true for the Sabbath. We see that often happening in the Bible. Anyway, now this first sentence that we're going to get to in chapter 6, verse 1, causes a lot of confusion for a lot of scholars. If you have a King James version, it most likely says, and it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. My newest NIV says the same thing. The old NIV that I have just says one Sabbath and carries on. That phrase, and it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, literally translated is the first Sabbath. And that phrase, the first Sabbath, is only found here. Nowhere else in the Bible is it found. In fact, it's not found in any other Greek literature of that day and time. So we have no way of nailing down exactly what Luke was trying to say. We don't know what he meant by the first Sabbath. There's a lot of ideas what he might have meant. And if you go to the commentaries, there's actually 7 or 8 listings of what Luke might have meant when he said that, because there's a first Sabbath every month. There's a first Sabbath every year. There's a first Sabbath after certain holidays. This could have been the second one of those. And there's a lot of talk about one commentary I went to on these 11 verses, spent half the time discussing this issue of what Luke meant about this phrase. But fortunately, if you go through those 7 or 8 ideas of what he meant, none of them actually impact the context of what he's trying to say, fortunately. So all we really need to get out of it is this was a Sabbath. Some translations actually ignore it altogether, as this old NIV that just says one Sabbath, so-and-so happened. And that's what this NIV that I'm reading out, that's the way it's going to handle it. So chapter 6, verse 1. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" They were going through a grain field and eating. And as I said, we don't know what Sabbath this was, but this grain, as it's described in the Greek and even in the English, sounds like wheat. Sounds like they're picking wheat and eating it. And it was ripe, but it hadn't been harvested yet. So if you nail down when this could have been. They say it was probably somewhere between late April and early June. So we know this was probably springtime. It's about all we really know about what Sabbath this was. But they're going through this grain field and they're picking grain and eating it. And that is allowed in the Old Testament. You can, if you're hungry and you're at a grain field and there's grain available, you can pick it and eat it. So notice the Pharisees didn't accuse them of stealing grain. They said, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? The law of doing no work at all on the Sabbath is mentioned frequently in the Old Testament. It's mentioned every time the Ten Commandments are mentioned. It's mentioned in many places individually. It's spoken of fairly frequently in the Old Testament that you don't do work on the Sabbath. Now, in Exodus 35, verse 2 and 3, which I have here, I will read, it actually gives us some interesting facts about working on the Sabbath. It says, for 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it is to be put to death. Do not light a fire in your dwelling on the Sabbath day. Notice the penalty for working on the Sabbath is death. You could be stoned for doing that. And it gives an example here of not starting a fire in your house, in your dwelling. So why does Jesus feel free to break the Sabbath and allow his disciples to do also, break the laws that they have governing Sabbath? Well, the problem comes down to defining that term work on the Sabbath. The Old Testament gave us two examples in all it talks about the Sabbath. It only gave us two examples of what work is. One we just read, where you're not supposed to start a fire in your dwelling on the Sabbath. Another one is mentioned in Jeremiah 17, verse 21. And there it talks about people carrying burdens on the Sabbath, which they weren't supposed to do. So those two examples is all you've got to define work. You got the fire and the carrying the burden. So to really apply this law, we're going to have to define what work is. Well, in the absence of a way to measure calorie output or whatever, the religious leaders set down a list of do's and don'ts. And it got to be pretty extensive. I'm going to read some of the things you cannot do on the Sabbath so you get an idea of what is not allowed. And this list is things you can't do. Sowing a crop, plowing, reaping, threshing, winnowing, sifting, kneading, shearing, spinning, sewing fabric, hunting, dressing a kill, riding, using a tool, climbing a tree, riding an animal, swimming, clapping your hands, dancing, or becoming engaged. I'm not sure how much work's involved in becoming engaged, but that's not allowed on the Sabbath. Now, they did provide some exceptions. Priests could do all their duties that they're required to do on the Sabbath, which were pretty extensive, so they were doing actually a good bit of work on the Sabbath, but that was allowed. You could take action to avoid mortal danger. If you were in danger, you could do something to get out of danger. You could save a life on the Sabbath. Childbirth was allowed on the Sabbath. Also, you could circumcise a child because it had to be circumcised 8 days after birth. And if that fell on the Sabbath, you could circumcise a child on the Sabbath. They also allowed walking up to about half a mile, a little over half a mile, 2,000 cubits. So because of all this work they went through and the effort they did, we now know what work is, and we can avoid that on the Sabbath, right? So when Jesus and his disciples are going through the grain field, did they do any work? That's the question. Well, when they picked grain, they were reaping, and they rubbed it together, they were threshing. And when they blew away the chaff, they were winnowing. So several things there. Also, in all this, it's considered preparing a meal, which is also on the no-no list. So the Pharisees have a point here. It looks like Jesus and his disciples were working. The problem is this excessive expansion of the laws and enforcing it at this meticulous level, it gives the Pharisees a lot of authority, and they seem to enjoy letting people know when they were working on the Sabbath. But it actually became a burden to the people. The laws in the Old Testament were never meant to be more important than a person's well-being. Remember, the Sabbath was made for man, right? Now, Jesus could have argued these finer points with the Pharisees, which we never find him doing. You never find them getting in a tit-for-tat argument about the finer points of the law, which the Pharisees would have enjoyed, probably getting into those discussions to show what they know. But we never find Jesus actually doing that. What he did is he usually goes straight to the heart of the matter, which we see in verse 3 of chapter 6. And Jesus answered them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Now, they had asked Jesus a question. Why is he doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus actually responds, the way he often does is he responds with a question to them. When you do that, it kind of requires your opponent to think and come up with an answer, right? So it's a good way of avoiding these detailed arguments. The event Jesus is describing is found in 1 Samuel 2 or 21:6. And the text doesn't tell us there, but that event took place on the Sabbath, because it does tell us that the bread had been removed from the table of presence before God, and that occurred every Sabbath. So this bread had just been removed and given to David and his men, so this must have occurred on the Sabbath. Now, if you remember that story, David was fleeing from Saul, he and his men, and David usually had a mule, so he was probably riding this mule. So according to these laws, he was traveling over half a mile. He was riding an animal, so he broke 2 Sabbath rules there. And now he's eating bread that's only allowed for the priest to eat. So when Jesus gives them this example, it's a great example of the same situation Jesus and his men were in. The point Jesus is trying to make, of course, is that the human needs and the circumstances you find yourself in permit exceptions to this rigid application that the Jews were doing with the law. The Pharisees, if the Pharisees had had compassion for people, this tolerance that needs to be there would have occurred naturally. Now, Mark's gospel at this event reports that this is when Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, man was given one day out of 7 that he could rest. And the Pharisees had turned it into a burden that they have to keep. We might say it in the way we say things today, that we should first and foremost have compassion for our fellow man before we beat him over the head with the Bible. The concern for your fellow man and the compassion comes before we tell them what all they did wrong. Verse 5, then, Jesus says to them, and he changes the whole direction of the argument here when he does this. He just gave them an example of how he didn't break the Sabbath when you actually apply the law as you should. But now he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And he did the same thing. He used that same title when he told the paralytic that his sins were forgiven. Now, Daniel used that term to describe the Messiah. So Jesus is using that term kind of as a messianic title for himself. And the Pharisees no doubt understood this. They could be aware that Jesus is calling himself the Messiah. So what Jesus is basically saying is the Messiah has the right to forgive sins and to interpret Sabbath laws. Now, this claim to deity, actually, we see later on down around verse 11, really is enraging the Pharisees. Now we come to this fifth and last conflict we're covering today between Jesus and the Pharisees. And this conflict also involves the Sabbath. And still in chapter 6, verse 6. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. By the way, Luke's the only one that tells us it was his right hand. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Now, we don't know how much time passed between that other Sabbath and this one. If you look through the Gospels and look at how many times Jesus went to synagogues and was teaching, it appears every Sabbath Jesus was at a synagogue, because you see it frequently in the Gospels. So this could have just been a week or two later, or it could have been as late as a year later. Some scholars say that this man with the shriveled up hand was actually planted by the Pharisees just so they could accuse Jesus. We're never really told that in the scriptures, but knowing the Pharisees, it could probably be true. The tradition has it that this man was a mason, and his hand got injured on the job when he was shaping stone, and his hands then shriveled up, and he could no longer work as a mason, and now he was a beggar. That's what the tradition of the church holds. It's interesting that the Pharisees knew Jesus could heal this guy, and that he probably would heal this guy, but they still didn't accept his claim to deity. Now, healing was allowed on the Sabbath if you were saving someone's life. And there were actually people in that day and time that healed, and they got paid for that. That was their day job. So if you're one of those people and you're healing on the Sabbath, you're actually doing your normal work, which is actually against the laws of the Sabbath. That all made sense. But of course, Jesus wasn't doing this for money. Verse 8, but Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand in front of everyone. So he got up and stood there. Now, the teachers of the synagogue were usually up front of the audience and sitting at a table. And this man was in the audience. Now, Jesus, while he's teaching, if you think about it, while he's teaching, he could have quietly, indiscreetly healed this guy while he's sitting in the audience and nobody would really know. But Jesus was there to teach and to change hearts. So this is a teaching opportunity. So he's not going to pass it up. So even with the Pharisees watching and paying close attention, Jesus addresses this 600-pound gorilla in the room and tells the guy to get up and come up front. It's believed he came up and stood next to the table where Jesus would have been sitting. Again, Jesus poses a question. Verse 9, then he said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? Notice he didn't give them the option of doing nothing. He says it's either doing good or doing evil. And he implies that doing nothing was the same as doing evil. In other words, if we're in a situation where there's somebody in front of us that we can help, we have the means to help that person, and we do nothing, Jesus is more or less saying that's evil. We should probably keep that in mind. Verse 10, he looked around at them and then said to the man, stretch out your hand. He did so, and his hand was completely restored. Jesus had asked a question earlier, which is if it's right to do good on the Sabbath. And now he's looking around the room for an answer, and he gets no response. Nobody wants to deal with it. So there's probably a very heavy silence in the room, don't you think? Well, Jesus breaks this silence, and he tells the guy to stretch out his hand. And the tense of that verb, restored, implies that the hand was healed as soon as it was stretched out. When it became visible, it was healed. Some commentaries say that the man's act of coming up front and stretching out his hand showed that he had faith, and his faith healed him. It's possible, but we're not told that in the scriptures. And Jesus can actually heal when there is no faith. There's some spots where we see that in the scripture. In the first conflict covered last week, Jesus healed a man that was lowered through the roof. And here in this last conflict, he's healing a guy with this shriveled up hand in the synagogue. Now, these acts of healing should have validated Jesus's claim to deity and won over the Pharisees. But we see the exact opposite happening there in verse 11. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Matthew and Mark report at this time that the leaders actually started plotting how they can kill Jesus. Now, it's interesting, the zeal they had for the law and the concern for keeping their religious laws was actually what drove them to want to murder Jesus. But I'm sure any way you interpret the Old Testament laws, murder is against the law. So that here they are ready to break their own law just because Jesus was breaking their laws. You can see that they're kind of blinded by their own love for their system, their lack of love for the fellow man. If we look back over all these conflicts and we look at how Jesus interacted with these Pharisees, we can see that what Jesus was trying to do was trying to teach them how to interpret the law, teach them how to have compassion for their fellow man. And the problem appears to be that these Pharisees, these religious leaders, were totally unteachable. They really didn't want to have anything to do with what Jesus is trying to show them. Even when he would give them Old Testament examples, they tend to ignore his logic. Therefore, we can kind of see why Jesus couldn't put his new wine into their old wineskins, can't we? Their old system, their old teachings, their traditions, their ceremonies, their customs wouldn't really bend to Jesus's teachings. So we can go back and look at that story about the wineskins and the garments, and we can kind of understand why Jesus didn't go to the religious leaders when he came as the Messiah. He went to the common man and started over. The old system wasn't fixable. The last paragraph in the teacher's commentary says something interesting about all of this. I'd like to read it. Believers today also can fall into the trap of valuing traditions and rituals too highly. They can forget that the church is not an institution to serve, but a people beloved by God and called to love God and others as themselves. Unlike the Pharisees, may we hear the words of Jesus and humbly submit ourselves to his teaching. A note from the Application Study Bible on these verses says something similar. I'll read it. The Pharisees thought their religious system had all the answers. They could not accept Jesus because he did not fit into their system. We could miss Christ for the same reason. Beware of thinking that you or your church has all the answers. No religious system is big enough to contain Christ completely or to fulfill perfectly all his desires for the world. Of course, we know when you chase other ideas, other teachings, that you may be led astray. So we need to keep in mind what Jesus said about seeking truth. He said in Matthew 7:7, in the Sermon on the Mount, ask and it will be given you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open to you. We should never think we have it all figured out. We should always be seeking.